Emily had always been a hard-working girl. She had been working at Marino's, a well-known family restaurant in town, for almost a year. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but she was grateful for it. She needed the money to support herself and save for college. Every day, she arrived on time, tied her apron, and put on a smile, ready to serve the customers. The restaurant was always busy, especially in the evenings. Families, couples, and groups of friends came in, looking for a warm meal and a good time. Emily enjoyed meeting new people and chatting with the regulars. She had a natural charm that made customers feel welcome. Even when she was tired, she kept her energy up, making sure everyone at her tables was happy. Despite her hard work, the job wasn't always easy. Some days were stressful, with orders piling up and customers getting impatient. Some people were rude, treating her like she was invisible or speaking to her in a harsh tone. But Emily never let it bring her down. She believed in being kind, no matter what. She knew that if she worked hard, things would get better. Her coworkers liked her too. She was always willing to help out, whether it was covering a shift for someone or helping clean up after a long night. Even the kitchen staff, who were often grumpy from the heat and pressure of cooking, appreciated her cheerful attitude. She wasn't just another employee, she was part of the team. Mr. Marino, the owner, was a strict man. He had been running the restaurant for years and liked things done his way. He rarely smiled and often walked around with a serious look on his face. Emily had always been polite to him, and he had never given her any trouble before. She knew he expected his employees to work hard, and she did her best to meet those expectations. That night, the restaurant was packed. It was a Friday evening, one of the busiest nights of the week. Emily rushed from table to table, taking orders, bringing food, and refilling drinks. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. The smell of freshly cooked pasta and grilled steak made the place feel warm and inviting. Emily had just finished helping a family when she saw Mr. Marino standing near the counter, looking angry. She didn't know why, but something about the way he was staring at her made her nervous. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward him. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, everything was about to change. Emily was still catching her breath after serving a large group when she noticed Mr. Marino standing near the cash register. His face was tense, and his eyes were scanning the restaurant. Something was wrong. The usual noise of customers chatting and laughing continued, but Emily felt a strange shift in the air. She had seen Mr. Marino upset before, but this time, he looked different. His expression was sharper, his movements stiff. He was tapping his fingers on the counter, looking around as if searching for someone. Then his eyes locked onto Emily. "Emily, come here," he called out, his voice louder than usual. Emily felt her heart skip a beat. She quickly walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, Mr. Marino. Is something wrong?" she asked politely. His stare was cold. "There is money missing from the register," he said. $50. It was here earlier, and now it's gone." Emily blinked in surprise. "Oh, I don't know what happened, sir. I've only been taking orders and handling customers." Mr. Marino folded his arms. "You were the last one near the register. The money was here before the dinner rush, and now it's not." Emily's stomach tightened. She had worked here for almost a year and had never been accused of anything like this. She looked around at the other employees, hoping someone would step in and help. A few of them glanced her way, but no one spoke up. The kitchen staff peeked through the window, sensing the tension. "Sir, I would never take anything," Emily said, keeping her voice steady. "Maybe we should check the cameras. Maybe someone else." Mr. Marino cut her off. "Are you saying I don't know how to run my own business? I don't need cameras to tell me what I already know." His voice was sharp now, loud enough that a few customers turned their heads. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to defend herself, to say something, but she was afraid. What if he didn't believe her? What if she lost her job over something she didn't do? "I didn't take anything," she said again, her voice quieter this time. Mr. Marino exhaled, shaking his head. If you didn't take it, then where is it? Emily didn't know what to say. She felt trapped. More customers were starting to notice the scene unfolding. She could hear whispers. Some looked concerned, while others just watched. She had never felt so humiliated before. The job she had worked so hard for, the respect she had earned, everything was suddenly at risk. And no matter how much she tried to explain, it seemed like Mr. Marino had already made up his mind. Emily's hands trembled as she stood frozen in place. The entire restaurant seemed quieter now, as if everyone had stopped what they were doing to listen. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her. Mr. Marino's face was tight with frustration, his arms crossed as he waited for an answer. I don't know where the money is," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Marino scoffed. "That's not a good enough answer." He turned to the other employees. "Did anyone see her take anything? Anyone?" Silence. Emily glanced at her coworkers, hoping someone would speak up for her, but no one did. Some looked away, pretending to be busy wiping tables or organizing menus. A few looked guilty, but no one dared to challenge the boss. A couple of customers sitting near the counter whispered among themselves. A woman with a concerned look on her face leaned toward her husband. "She doesn't seem like the type," she muttered, but the man just shook his head. "I have never stolen anything in my life," Emily said, her voice stronger now. "Please, sir, there has to be another explanation." Mr. Marino sighed heavily. "Then prove it." Emily's heart pounded. "How?" "Empty your pockets," he demanded. Emily hesitated. She felt her face grow warm with embarrassment. "But if you have nothing to hide." "Then do it," he interrupted. The restaurant fell completely silent now. Even the kitchen noises had died down. The servers who had been walking around stopped in their tracks. It was as if the entire place had come to a standstill, waiting to see what would happen next. Emily felt tears sting her eyes. This wasn't fair. She had been nothing but loyal to this job. She had stayed late, covered extra shifts, and always treated customers with kindness. And now, just like that, she was being treated like a criminal. "Sir, please, this isn't right," she tried once more. Mr. Marino's expression didn't soften. "Either you prove you didn't take it, or you're out of a job." Emily's stomach dropped. She needed this job. Without it, paying rent would become impossible. But how could she let herself be humiliated like this? She swallowed hard and slowly reached into her pockets. She pulled them inside out. Nothing but a receipt and a crumpled napkin. "See," she said, her voice shaking. "I told you." Mr. Marino narrowed his eyes. "That's not enough. What about your apron, your sleeves?" Emily's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about proving innocence anymore. This was about control, about power. And she wasn't sure how much more she could take. All around her, the restaurant waited. Would anyone step in? Would anyone defend her? Or would she have to stand there, alone, as the worst night of her life continued to unfold? Emily's hands shook as she turned her pockets inside out, revealing nothing but a crumpled napkin and a receipt. She looked up at Mr. Marino, hoping this would be enough to convince him. But his eyes were still cold, filled with doubt. "That's not enough," he said, shaking his head. "Take off your apron. Roll up your sleeves." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. This was going too far. She could feel the heat rising in her face, not from guilt, but from embarrassment and anger. "Sir, I have done nothing wrong," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "You have no reason to treat me like this." Mr. Marino crossed his arms. "If you didn't take the money, then prove it." Emily looked around the restaurant, searching for support. Her coworkers stood frozen, their faces filled with discomfort, but none of them spoke up. Customers whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others simply watching like it was a show. A man at a nearby table leaned forward. "This isn't right," he muttered to his wife. "She's just a kid." His wife nodded but stayed silent. Emily's throat felt tight. She had spent months working hard in this restaurant, giving it her best every single day. And now her boss was treating her like she was nothing. Slowly, she untied her apron and handed it over. Her hands were unsteady as she rolled up her sleeves. There. See. Nothing. Mr. Marino stared at her for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Empty your shoes. A gasp rippled through the room. Emily's eyes widened. What? You heard me, he said. Take off your shoes. Prove you're not hiding anything. That was the moment Emily realized this wasn't about the missing money anymore. This was about humiliation. Mr. Marino had already made up his mind that she was guilty, and now he wanted to break her in front of everyone. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her whole body was trembling now. This isn't fair, she whispered, her voice barely audible. A woman near the entrance suddenly stood up. That's enough. All eyes turned to her. She was a regular customer, someone who had been coming to Marino's for years. She looked furious. You have no right to do this to her. If you really think she took the money, check the cameras. But this is wrong. A few other customers murmured in agreement. Someone pulled out their phone, recording the scene. Mr. Marino's face darkened. He looked around and seemed to realize that the situation was slipping out of his control. But instead of backing down, he clenched his fists and took a step closer to Emily. This is my restaurant, he snapped, and I'll run it how I see fit. But he didn't know that his words, his actions, were about to cost him everything. Emily's breath came in short, shaky gasps. Her whole body trembled, not from fear, but from shock and humiliation. She had already emptied her pockets, rolled up her sleeves, and handed over her apron. But Mr. Marino wasn't satisfied. He wanted to push her further, to completely break her in front of everyone. Take off your shoes, he ordered again, his voice firm. Emily felt her stomach turn. Her legs felt weak, and her hands were cold. She couldn't believe this was happening. All she had ever done was work hard, stay late when needed, and treat customers with kindness. And now she was being treated like a criminal in front of the very people she had spent months serving. She swallowed hard, looking around the restaurant. The silence was thick, uncomfortable. Her coworkers stood frozen, too scared to say anything. Some of the customers looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Others, however, looked furious. One woman whispered to her husband, "This is not right. Someone needs to stop this." Another customer, a young man in the corner, held up his phone, recording everything. Emily took a deep breath. "No," she said quietly, but firmly. Mr. Marino's eyes widened slightly. "What did you say?" "No," Emily repeated, stronger this time. "I have done nothing wrong. I don't have to prove anything to you." A murmur spread through the restaurant. Some people nodded in agreement. Mr. Marino's face turned red with anger. "You're refusing to cooperate. That just makes you look guilty." Emily lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. "Or maybe it just makes you look like a bully." A gasp rippled through the room. For the first time, Mr. Marino hesitated. His authority had never been questioned like this before. Then, a voice from the back of the restaurant cut through the tension. "This is unacceptable." Everyone turned to see a woman standing up from her table. She was a well-dressed customer Emily recognized, Ms. Carter, a local lawyer who came in often. She stepped forward, her face stern. "You have no legal right to treat an employee like this," she said, crossing her arms. "You're publicly humiliating her without evidence. This is workplace harassment, and I suggest you stop before you make things worse for yourself." Mr. Marino's mouth opened, but no words came out. His confidence faltered. He looked around the room and finally noticed the people recording, the angry expressions, the disapproving stares. The damage was already done. At that moment, another employee, a young busboy, took a deep breath and spoke up. "Sir, I saw the cash register earlier. His voice was nervous, but he continued, "I don't think Emily took anything. Maybe we should check the cameras." Mr. Marino's face twitched. He knew he had lost control of the situation, but he had no idea that things were about to get even worse for him. The restaurant remained silent, except for the quiet murmurs of customers and the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Emily stood her ground, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She felt humiliated, but she also felt something new: determination. She wasn't going to let Mr. Marino break her. Mr. Marino's face was red with frustration. He had expected Emily to give in, to obey him without question. But now, people were watching. Customers were recording. A lawyer had stepped in, and even one of his own employees had suggested checking the cameras. "This is ridiculous," Mr. Marino muttered. He turned toward the young busboy who had spoken up. "You don't know what you're talking about." The busboy hesitated but stood firm. "I just think it's fair to check, sir. If she didn't take anything, the cameras will prove it." More people nodded in agreement. A few customers spoke up. "She deserves a fair chance. You're treating her terribly. Just check the cameras already." Mr. Marino's jaw tightened. He looked around, realizing that the situation was slipping out of his control. His restaurant, his authority, was being questioned in front of everyone. He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the sound of a police siren outside made him freeze. A moment later, 2 uniformed officers stepped into the restaurant. The crowd parted slightly as they walked toward the counter. One of them, a tall officer with a calm expression, addressed Mr. Marino directly. "We received a call about a disturbance," the officer said. "Can you tell us what's going on?" Mr. Marino straightened his posture, trying to appear in control. "It's nothing, officer. Just a misunderstanding with one of my employees." Emily's heart pounded. She hadn't called the police, so who did? Then she noticed a group of customers near the door whispering among themselves. One of them, a woman holding her phone, gave her a small nod. The officers glanced at Emily. "Miss, do you need help?" one of them asked gently. Emily swallowed hard and nodded. "I've been accused of stealing money, but I didn't take anything," she said. "I asked for the security cameras to be checked, but Mr. Marino refused." One of the officers turned back to Mr. Marino. "Is there a reason you're refusing to check the cameras?" Mr. Marino shifted uncomfortably. "I don't see why we need to. I already know." "That's not how this works," the officer interrupted. "If there's a theft, we investigate properly. Where's the security footage?" The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as Mr. Marino hesitated. He had no choice now. He clenched his jaw and finally gave a stiff nod toward the back office. "Fine. We'll check." Emily let out a shaky breath. She had fought to stand up for herself, and now, finally, the truth was about to come out. The tension in the restaurant was thick as everyone waited for Mr. Marino to lead the officers to the back office. Emily stood quietly, her heart racing. It had felt like an eternity since she'd first been accused. But now, the truth was finally within reach. She glanced around at the customers who had supported her. Some were still watching. Some had already left, but all of them had witnessed the unfairness she had endured. The officers walked with Mr. Marino to the small office in the back, and the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. A few minutes passed in silence, the noise of the kitchen and the clink of dishes fading into the background. Emily's mind raced, thinking about what might happen next. Was the footage going to prove her innocence? Would it clear her name, or would she still be the one blamed for something she didn't do? After what felt like forever, the door to the office swung open. Mr. Marino stepped out first, his face tight and expressionless. Behind him, one of the officers held a tablet in his hand, showing the footage from the restaurant's security cameras. The officer approached Emily. "We've reviewed the footage," he said, his voice calm. "And we've seen everything." Emily's chest tightened, but she stood tall. What did it show? The officer turned the tablet around so Emily could see. On the screen, it was clear as day. Emily was shown finishing a transaction with a family and then walking away from the cash register, never once reaching for the money. "The footage shows you did exactly what you said you did," the officer continued. "You never handled the register after the last transaction." Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The relief washed over her like a wave. Finally, the truth was out. "Then who did?" Mr. Marino muttered, his voice strained. The officer raised an eyebrow and turned to Mr. Marino. "That's something you should know, isn't it?" Mr. Marino's face darkened, and for a moment, it seemed like he wasn't sure whether to admit the truth or deny it. But when the officer walked over to the back counter and pointed to the footage of another employee, Marino's nephew, Jason, slipping something into his pocket, the truth became undeniable. Jason, who had been working in the kitchen, had been the one near the register when the money went missing. The footage clearly showed him grabbing the bills when he thought no one was looking. "Jason." Mr. Marino's voice cracked as he stared at the screen in disbelief. The young man in the kitchen, who had been working silently throughout the entire scene, walked out to join the group, his face pale. He didn't say a word but lowered his head, ashamed. The officers turned back to Mr. Marino. "Looks like your nephew is the one who took the money." Mr. Marino stared at Jason for a long time, his face a mixture of anger and betrayal. Finally, he turned to Emily. I'm sorry," he said, but it lacked any real sincerity. Emily stood still, taking a deep breath. She had hoped for an apology, but hearing it from Mr. Marino, after everything he had put her through, felt hollow. "You should be," she said softly, her voice firm. "But words don't undo what you did to me." The officers exchanged a look before one of them addressed Jason. "We're going to need you to come with us." Jason didn't resist. His shoulders slumped as he followed the officer out the door, and the quiet hum of the restaurant returned to life. But for Emily, the silence still felt heavy. The damage had been done. The humiliation, the stress, the fear, it would take time to heal. But she had proven her innocence, and that, at least, was something no one could take away from her. As the officers led Jason out of the restaurant, Emily stood there, still in shock. The whole ordeal felt surreal. She had been accused of something she didn't do, humiliated in front of her coworkers and customers, and now she was left to pick up the pieces. Her heart was still racing, but there was a sense of quiet relief mixed with disbelief. The tension in the room slowly began to dissipate as the truth came to light. The customers who had watched the entire situation unfold began to murmur among themselves. Some nodded in her direction, offering small smiles of support. A few of them came up to her as they gathered their things to leave. "I'm really sorry you had to go through that," one of them said, her voice soft but sincere. "I could see you were just trying to do your job." Emily managed a small smile. "Thank you," she replied. "It means a lot to hear that." Others stopped by to offer their apologies too, expressing disbelief at how things had unfolded. The woman who had spoken up earlier, the one who had warned Mr. Marino about the harassment, gave her a comforting nod as she passed. "I hope you'll be okay," the woman said. "You have every right to feel angry, but don't let him get away with treating you like that." Emily watched as the last of the customers left the restaurant, the door chimes ringing behind them. The place seemed emptier now, quieter. The normal buzz of activity that usually filled the air was replaced with a lingering sense of tension. She turned to face her coworkers, who were all gathered near the counter, watching her with a mix of guilt and uncertainty. No one had come to her defense, and she could feel the weight of that. But she didn't want to focus on the past anymore. "I guess it's over now," Emily said, her voice tired but steady. "Jason's been caught, and the truth is out." Her coworker, Lisa, stepped forward. She had been one of the quiet ones, avoiding eye contact during the whole ordeal. "Emily, I'm really sorry," she said, looking genuinely remorseful. "I should have said something sooner. We all should have." Emily nodded slowly. "It's not just about what you should have said. It's about what you didn't say. But I don't want to stay angry. Lisa looked down, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know what to say to make it right." "There's nothing you can say," Emily replied. "But maybe next time, when something wrong happens, you'll find the courage to speak up. Not just for me, but for anyone who's being treated unfairly." Lisa nodded, and a few others around the counter looked ashamed. Emily could see they were beginning to realize how much silence had allowed the situation to escalate. Later that evening, as Emily packed up to leave, the exhaustion finally hit her. She was physically drained, but more than that, she felt emotionally worn out. The anger from earlier had faded, replaced by a quiet sadness. It had been a long, difficult day, but somehow she had made it through. As she stepped outside into the cool night air, Emily took a deep breath. She had been through a lot, but she had held her ground. She had fought for her dignity, and she had stood up for herself when everything seemed to be falling apart. The city streets were quiet, the lights from nearby shops casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Emily didn't know what her next steps would be, whether she would continue working at the restaurant or find something new. But she knew this. She was stronger than she had been when she walked into that restaurant earlier that day. And that, at least, was something to hold on to.